Hey Nate, lesson 4 of our geography class. And today we're going to be talking about creation and the flood. If we're going to be talking about the earth and geography, then it would probably be a good idea for us to know where it all came from. And of course, the Bible tells us that God created the earth and everything on the earth from nothing. That would be the true definition of the word create. We are very creative. You are very creative. We could just list some of the things that you have done and made that just prove that you are a very creative young man. But I don't think that you ever made anything from nothing. And that's what God did. That is why He is the creator, because He made everything from nothing. There's only one way that can happen, and that is if the creator is greater, more powerful than that which he creates. And so that gives us a clue as to who God is. Any other explanation fails and boils down to the question, well, where did that come from? Well, where did that come from? Well, where did that come from? Until the person is just so frustrated because when they get to the very end, they have no other explanation other than there had to have been an intelligent creator that is responsible for creating everything from nothing. Paul tells us in the book of Romans that we are without excuse. There is no one that has any excuse that they had missed the fact that there is a creator. We are without excuse. All we need to do is just look around us, look at the beauty of creation and the power of creation and the design that we see in just so many things that we can look at. And we need to recognize that there has to have been a powerful, beautiful designer that is responsible for it all. The history of the earth can be divided into four phases: creation, the flood, the present world, and the future world. That would be the four phases of what the earth has gone through and will go through from beginning to end. So, in the first one, creation, we see that God gave the earth light, an atmosphere, land, and seas, and He took 6 days. It didn't take Him 6 days, He took 6 days. Do you understand the difference? How long should it have taken God to create everything? How long could it have taken God to create everything? He could have created everything that he took 6 days to do. He could have done that in a micromillisecond, just by the power of his word or the power of his breath. He could have. Why? Because he's God. But he took 6 days, and he had his reasons for doing that. First of all, that we could get an idea of what order is, and also because on that seventh day he rested, not because he was exhausted, but because he was done with creation. He had created everything that he had intended to create. And what did he say about his creation? It is good. After he created Adam and Eve, what did he say? It is very good. And then on the seventh day, he rested because he had completed his work. And as an example, that is what we are to do also. That while we may work in order to labor to support ourselves, we also need a time of not only rest for our bodies, but a day when we can concentrate on our Creator and worship Him for all that He has done and all that He has made. In those 6 days, God created the earth, and He filled it with soil and trees and vegetation. He created mature creatures. He didn't place eggs, chicken eggs, waiting for them to hatch and become chickens. No, he created chickens and roosters and animals of all kinds as mature adults. He filled the waters with mature creatures. He filled the air with mature creatures, and he filled the land with mature creatures. And then he made man in his own image and placed him in a very special garden that he had prepared especially for this man and woman that he had created in his own image. And he gave them dominion. He made them the boss over everything else that he had created for them to use for their good and to recognize his glory in them using that. And so that they could have a special relationship with their creator. So Adam and Eve were created for the purpose of having fellowship, a relationship with their creator, God. And we know how that went. They chose to disobey God. They chose to believe Satan's lies that if they ate from the one tree that they were forbidden from eating from, that they would know good and evil just like God does. Well, they knew good and evil, not the way God does, but they chose to disobey God's instruction, which was only for their own benefit. And we suffer the consequences of that. Because of that, everyone since then has been born with a sinful nature. And it is only because of the sacrifice of Jesus Christ that we are even able to stand before a holy and good God. Because in essence, we're wearing the cloak of Christ's goodness, Christ's righteousness, the Bible says. And that's what God sees when he looks at believers in him. The second phase of the earth would have been the flood. And we're going to spend most of our time here on the flood because it's the phase that has the most to do with geography, which is our subject. Other than creation, the flood is the most significant physical event in history, the most significant, the most important single physical event in all of history. It brought enormous changes to the crust of the earth, physical changes that we can see every day all around us. And driving along the highway, we see the physical changes that are a result of the flood. Actually, all of history is divided up into pre-flood and post-flood. What the earth was like before the flood and what the earth is like because of the flood and since the flood. Lifespans began to decrease. We know that before Noah, people lived, Adam lived like 916 years. Methuselah lived 990 some years. The man with the longest lifespan that has ever been recorded. They lived good long times. As a matter of fact, Adam was had only been dead a few years, maybe 100 years, when Noah was even born. So that is a long lifespans that they had. But as time goes on and the effects of the flood become more and more pronounced, a man's lifespan becomes less and less and less. More diseases, more genetic problems, as there are more and more people on the earth, and so people's lifespans begin to decrease. And the earth's surface was changed drastically, not only because of what happened to it during the flood, but what happened to it in the centuries after the flood, as it was drying out and the earth was settling back into a particular kind of formation. Catastrophe. The word catastrophe means it's an event that causes a great and often sudden change. It could even mean a suffering, that it could cause suffering too. Certainly, the flood would have been a catastrophe. It was a sudden event. It was caused great damage that came on suddenly, and great suffering. All, with the exception of 8 people, all of humankind was destroyed, was drowned. All, with few exceptions of the animals, was destroyed. That is what we call a catastrophe. And the evidences can be seen all over the globe of a catastrophe that occurred on the earth at one time in history. We have widespread fossil beds, and we'll talk about fossils another time. It's really a fascinating subject. But we have fossil beds that are miles deep, that contain hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of fossils. Fossils don't occur over a long period of time. It is something that is trapped, an animal or a leaf or something that is trapped within between layers of mud, and that mud hardens, and the fossil is what remains behind. The imprint of that animal or vegetation remains behind. And we have widespread fossil beds, thick layers of sedimentary rock and mineral deposits, and deep sculpted canyons are left behind because of the power of water. Certainly, you know the power of water. We have spent enough time on Block Island in the waters to know how powerful water can be. And certainly, the flood would have been a catastrophe that would have had a great effect on the Earth's surface. We might think that this is more of a study of geology as opposed to geography, but it really impacts both of those scientific studies. Now, just as there are people that would rather see if they can figure out some kind of alternative explanation for creation other than an almighty God, there are people that would like to figure out an alternative explanation for why for the changes in the Earth's crust, and they have come up with all kinds of ideas to their satisfaction explain how these changes have happened. Rather than a global flood, by global we mean those flood waters covered the whole globe, the whole Earth. They were not isolated to a particular area. But rather than a global flood, they seem to seek to explain those changes by saying that the Earth has been changing over billions of years. There was a time when these theories first started, like in the mid 1800s, when people would say, yes, these changes happened over thousands of years. And then it became evident that thousands of years could not explain the changes that we're observing. So then they went to millions of years. You know we're up to now? 65 billion years. It would take 65 billion years to explain the changes that we see on the Earth. And I bet that within a very short period of time, we'll be talking of hundreds of billions of years in order to come to any kind of explanation of why the changes on the Earth have happened. This position that claims a long period of time to make these changes is called uniformitarianism. Uniformitarianism, and I'll write that out so you can see what the word looks like. That's the theory that changes in the Earth's crust during geological history have resulted from the action of processes that are continuous and uniform. So that if we look at the Grand Canyon, and we see that it is all, we look at a cross section of it and we see all of these layers, the uniformitarianist would want us to believe that that happened by layer on layer on layer on layer being laid down in a uniform manner, the same amount year after year after year, until it builds up to a particular layer. Just, you know what? Common sense, logic tells us that that is kind of impossible. But that is what some people would rather believe, rather than believe that there was a huge catastrophe called a global flood that can account for the very same thing. Most scientists today actually don't hold to evolution. Evolution is that theory of uniformitarianism is what is involved in evolution. That everything started in a very primitive state and has improved and improved and improved over these 65 billion years. I don't see the world getting a whole lot better. Do you? No, I don't see the world getting a whole lot better. Just think, what happens with an iron chair when you leave it outside in the weather? It rusts. What happens to a fabric, to a piece of clothing, if it's stored away in a trunk for, maybe 100 years? What happens when you pick it up out of the trunk? It probably is going to fall apart. It's definitely going to be faded, and it's probably going to fall apart. What happens to a house when it's left uncared for? Not good things. What happens to a driveway or a parking lot when it's left untended and doesn't get repaved? Weeds start coming up in all the cracks. Just come to my house and look at our driveway if you don't believe me. That is what we see. Devolution, not evolution. Things are getting worse and falling apart, not getting better. And most scientists recognize that fact, so they don't fall for the uniformitarianist philosophy. They don't fall for evolution. They pretty much have dismissed evolution. They call themselves not easy for me to say, neo-catastrophists. Neo-catastrophists. Catastrophist has the word catastrophe in it. Neo means sort of on the side of, but not fully on the side of. So while they reject the biblical account of a creator God making everything from nothing, but they also admit that gradual, uniform processes that is part of evolution cannot explain the condition of the Earth's surface. So they call themselves neo-catastropher, or whatever, the word. The Bible is specific in telling us many details of the flood. It tells us what, how, where, when, and why. What? It was a flood of great proportions that covered the whole earth. That's what the scripture says. It was a great flood that covered the whole earth. How? God released massive amounts of water and magma that exploded both from land and sea. There were volcanoes underneath the sea on the ocean floor that exploded, pushing water, hot water, and magma, lava, up into the air and back onto the earth, all over the globe. And there was torrential rain that fell from the skies for 40 days and 40 nights without ceasing. We know how much rain we can collect in our rain gauges A torrential downpour can give us an inch, 2 inches, 3 inches of rain in just an hour's worth of time. I have measured 3 inches of rain that has fallen in just an hour's worth of time in a very heavy storm. When we watch the weather forecasters and they're talking about hurricanes, that perhaps there will be 10 to 15 inches of rain falling in one place, causing massive flooding. That is a terrible thing. It's very dramatic. Imagine that kind of rain, torrential rain, for 40 days and 40 nights, solid, combined with the magma and the water that's coming up out of the ocean and from the land. I think I'd call that a catastrophe. Wouldn't you? Yeah, I would call it a catastrophe. So that's the how. God released all of that. Where? The entire earth was flooded. The scripture tells us that the water covered the earth to 22 feet above the high hills. The highest hills that were on the earth at that time, the flood waters were 22 feet higher than that. When? About 1600 years after the earth was created. About 1600 years after the earth was created, God destroyed it in a flood, saving only 8 people. What was the result? The mountains rose. Some mountains are still rising, an inch a year perhaps, but some mountains are still rising as a result of the catastrophe of the flood. The tectonic plates that the Earth's crust sits on are collided. The single supercontinent that was the land broke up, so that now we have 7 major continents. The Earth's surface was fractured. Layers of vegetation and soil and animal carcasses were churned up into layer upon layer of sediment. The heavy layer of water that was on top of all of those layers underneath it compressed those layers, forming all kinds of things, oil, gas, peat, all kinds of things were formed because of the weight of the water on those various layers. And then the action of the plates crashing into each other took those layers and folded them and buckled them and twisted them. And as I say, when we're driving down the highways, we can see a lot of that buckling and twisting of the rocks. There truly is no other explanation as to how that could have happened. Then what happened? And then after that was all over, then the climate cooled due to the large amounts of water vapor and volcanic dust that were in the atmosphere that blocked the sun. And so all of that cooled. Snow and ice formed at the poles. Remember we talked about the shape of the globe and the sun and how it beats on the Earth, and we have that area between the Tropic of what? Cancer, and in the south, the Tropic of Capricorn. Remember, the sun beats on that area where there are we can see sunrises and sunsets. Above that and below that, not so much. We can't really identify them. So the poles, the South Pole and the North Pole, are the coldest parts of the globe. And ice and snow formed there, producing a single ice age. As that water vapor evaporated and the volcanic dust went up into the atmosphere or dispersed, then the Earth started to get warm again, and then the snow and ice of the polar regions began to melt. And we have places like Block Island that are a result of that polar ice melting and glaciers just dragging sediment down the coast of the United States. And we can talk about that a little bit later. Global warming is a reality. Global warming is what happens as the Earth returns to a more temperate global climate. It is normal. It is normal. I don't know what else to tell you. Certainly, there are certain aspects, and all the environmentalists aren't entirely wrong, but if they think that human beings are causing climate global warming, that's not the whole story. Global warming is a normal thing. It's been happening ever since the time of the flood. And then the Bible actually tells us why. Why what? We've forgotten even what we're talking about. The Bible concerning the flood tells us what, where, when, and why. How and why. Why? Because God unleashed his wrath. What is wrath? Intense anger on the wickedness of the people, destroying those who had hardened their hearts toward the Creator, and providing salvation for those who had a heart toward Him. And how many people were they? 8. Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives, their three wives. 8 people had a heart willing to be saved. The others were just enjoying their wickedness, and their wickedness had become their idol, their God. And so God destroyed them and the rest of creation with them in order to be able to save those who would be saved. Because that's why God made man in the first place, to have a relationship with him. So that kind of takes care of the flood. We have a creation and the flood. Now we go to the current world. Still testifies to the glory, to the greatness, to the perfection of God, doesn't it? Even in a world that is so marred, so broken down, there are still things that are so impressive. The Grand Canyon, I mentioned before. Pipa and I have been to the Grand Canyon. Pipa has actually been there a couple of times. It is a most wondrous place. The colors and the size and the majesty of the Grand Canyon is just amazing. Your mom has been to the African savannah, that great plateau where the animals just run free. If you remember Ice Age, the animals, the wildebeests, just rushing across the African savannah. Pretty impressive, isn't it? Even if it is animated, it's still very impressive because it represents something that is real. The power of volcanoes and hurricanes and tsunamis is just, who can deny the power? This year has been an exceptional year. The hurricanes are named after people's names. Well, we've gotten all the way to the end of the alphabet. Now we need to start naming the hurricanes after the letters of the Greek alphabet, because there have been so many hurricanes and severe tropical storms. A lot of them that have approached the United States have churned around in the Gulf of Mexico. Remember, we were talking about the Gulf of Mexico, our last lesson. That is a usual path for hurricanes that approach the United States coastline. Something as simple as freshly fallen snow. Haven't we all walked outside on the morning after it snowed all night long, and there's no footsteps, no tire tracks, nothing on the snow? It's the sun is shining and it's glistening off the snow. Isn't that wondrous? Isn't that beautiful? Certainly, we see signs of God's beautiful creation all around us, and if we really pay attention, we can see things every day. I have been known to sit on that bench outside my back door with just one of the flowerets from a rhododendron bush. You know, the rhododendron bush? Just take out one of those flowerets and just stare at it and meditate on it. full of wonder of how something can have that color and that beauty and that symmetry and that design. And God's creation is really beautiful. And then the last part is the future world. We know that God has not thrown his creation away. Could he have? Yeah, he could have. It was his to throw away if that's what he chose to do. Would it have taken a whole lot of effort? No, no more effort than it took for him to begin the workings of the flood at the time of Noah. He could have just as he breathed the universe into existence, he could have breathed its destruction in just as easy a way if he had chosen to. But he chose not to. He promised instead to release his creation, the epitome of his creation, from bondage. What is the bondage that we are under? It's the bondage of sin. That is what we are. That is what prevents us from being able to face God eyeball to eyeball. And he promised to put an end to that, and he did by sending his son to die on a cross, bearing the sins of the world, so that all the penalty for all the sins of the world was paid. That's what he did. That's what he promised. That was his original intention, to restore his creation back to himself, to restore any part of his creation that desired to spend eternity with him. He doesn't force anybody. If somebody would rather honor another God of their own making, then God honors that. He's not going to force anybody into heaven. Would it be heaven if that's what he did? That's not how the way God works. So he promised instead to restore his creation from the bondage of sin and to restore all of creation back to the way that he originally intended it to be. So that was kind of a combination of a Bible study and a geography lesson. But it was kind of important for us to sort of establish where we're coming from, especially as we move on into our study. So let's go on and see what else I have for you today. Hands on.